All right. Hello. Hello again. Here we are. I think this is lecture 3, 4? 4. Wow, we're making some progress. You see my disco ball going behind me? Yeah, I can move my computer so you can see. So I set that's my Peloton bike, which I'm trying to use to keep from getting fat. Oh, there, you see it? I moved my disco ball into my bedroom because this is the only room that gets like really good sun, and it has been so much fun. Right now the cats are not excited by it. Those are my 2 cats. They are not excited by the disco ball, but that's because Nimi's the black and white one. She just played with the disco ball for quite a hunk of time. So this is lecture 4 as stated, and this is start kind of introducing Kindred a bit more. Kindred, which is what you should have read the prologue and the river at this point. Just the first 2 chapters. The prologue doesn't really count as a chapter. It's kind of its own little special thing, which we will talk about today. So let's get started. Let me find my lecture. Oh, nope, that's my other resources. Here we go, and I lost my face. There we go. Where's my face? There's my face. Okay, so hi, I'm back. I was hiding there for a second. My husband and kids just went running, so I actually have like an hour to myself, which I can't believe I'm using it to make a class, video instead of, meditating or just enjoying the silence. But, we all got to get paid here. So more introduction to Kindred. So today we're going to talk about the slave narrative, the neo-slave narrative, and wondering like where Kindred fits into these 2 genres. Now, I know you've only read like 18 pages of the novel so far, and you actually haven't even been introduced to the fact that Dana, the main character, the protagonist, the heroine of the novel, is traveling back in time to the time of slavery. That comes up in the next chapter in the fire. So sorry, spoiler alert. But I think we had already talked about this in class. But these are 2 genres, the slave narrative and the neo-slave narrative, that I believe that Octavia Butler was working in between the 2, and then adding her own little twist with time travel in it. And it's just the 2 genres to keep in mind because they definitely play into the themes and the messaging that the author, Octavia Butler, has for you, the reader. And if you understand what these 2 genres actually are, you can see how she kind of does both of them inside this novel, and probably to communicate something to you. All right. I will review what your homework is for over spring break at the end of this lecture. But I also just want to encourage all of you that if you ever find yourself going to do the reading and discussion posts and you do not understand what I'm asking for, please just text and ask me for clarification. Don't skip questions because then you won't get full credit. And don't just think you're stupid or you can't figure it out, because usually if you even just text me like, hey, I don't get what you're saying, like blah, 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 we can have a little back and forth, which I actually really enjoy because that's what we would be doing if we were in class. And, you get some clarification, and it's very insightful for me to see how you're processing this, because I've read this book. I think this is the 5th time I'm reading it. So it's hard for me to remember what it was like to read it for the first time and what parts of it might not be as clear to you as reading it for the first time. Because to me, if I'm reading it for my 5th time, I have all this background knowledge about it now that, from having read it so many times. So it's really helpful for me for you to ask questions. So please, I never, ever, ever think that there's a stupid question, unless the question is like, what book are we reading now? Actually, given the state of the world, I would even tolerate a question like that. Hopefully you all have copies of the book. If you have not been able to secure a copy yet, I need to look into this, and I need to write a note to myself because I keep meaning to do certain things and then I forget because I have complete COVID-19 ADD. Ask or find out NYPL. So my daughter is doing like a little book club with some of her friends from middle school, and they are all reading a book online that they all were able to check out the Kindle, or it's not a Kindle, but like an electronic book from the Brooklyn Public Library. So if you have a library card for a library branch near you, you might be able to check the book out and start reading it if you have been unable to get a copy. Or if you've been unable to get a copy for, 5,000 different reasons that could be legitimate at this point in time, please, 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 please let me know. Please. Also Google around online, because this book is pretty old at this point. It came out in, 1979 when I was 5 years old. And so there might be a PDF online too, if you want to be really nosy and look around for it. Okay. All right, let's get started. Boom. All right. Sorry, my PowerPoint's off the page a little bit. All right, there we go. So you were supposed to read the prologue and the first chapter called The River. So I wanted to back it up a little and talk about what is a prologue. And this is just good stuff to know as a reader, like to understand the purpose of a prologue. So prologue comes from the Greek word prologos, which means before. Pro means before, and logos means word. So it's the opening of a story, like a pre-story story. I used to have this guy, or know this guy. It was my friend's boyfriend. Sorry, I'm going to digress here. Those of you who've had me before in class know that I digress. I digress a lot. But he used to joke that before he had coffee in the morning, he had to have coffee before his coffee. He had to have a pre-coffee coffee. So a prologue is like a pre-story story. So before the actual story, like the meaty part of the story, it's like a pre-story story that's supposed to get you ready for the story. Just like his pre-coffee coffee was the coffee that he had in order to wake up enough so that he could then have his coffee and then actually go to work and start his day. All right. So it's the opening of a story that establishes certain elements of this coming story. So sometimes it will establish setting, background details, characters, and it tells a story that's either an earlier story or a later story to the story that you're about to read. So it either is like a flashback or a like flash forward. Not a foreshadowing, because it's not hinting about what's coming. It's telling you something that's coming. So it's either a flashback of something that happened and it's already done, or it's a flash forward of something that would be like the, not the climax of the coming story, but something close to it that then is going to connect back to the main story. So what happens in Kindred is the prologue is actually it's a snippet story that would be comes from the very end of the book. So what she does is she takes a piece from the very end of the book and she puts it in the very beginning of the book as a teaser for you to make you interested and to get you hooked into the novel. As a way for you to be like, what? And then it'll keep you reading, right? So if you look at the very first line, so for those of you who were in my film class last semester when we studied short stories and we wrote our own short stories, the first lines are very important. The first line of a book, the first line of a story, because it really just establishes the intrigue of the story, like the tone, what's being said. Is it shocking? Is it scary? Is it curious, where you're just wondering what is going to happen next? Is it beautiful? does the line open with like this beautiful description that just like pulls you straight into a space or a place. My head over a tiny bit. I wonder if I can do that. Nope. Sorry, I feel like I'm being smushed out by my PowerPoint here. Anyway, so the first line of this book, if you have it near you, you can read it along with me, but I typed it in here. So in the prologue, we find out several things. The very first line of the entire book. I lost an arm on my last trip home. My left arm. Lost an arm? Like I lost it. Where's my arm? So we obviously are assuming that like arm is gone. So what? Like, I go home all the time to North Carolina to see my mom, which I still call home. I don't lose an arm when I go home, like on the regular, So some curious things in this very first line. I lost my arm. How does that happen? Right? That's not normal. Home. She calls where she goes home. Hold that in your little beautiful brains for later, okay? And my left arm. Now I'm still I'm like, what does left arm symbolize? Does it mean something? I'm not sure. So that's something to just hold in your brain here. The next line is also really beautiful. I didn't put it in the PowerPoint, but it's a hint of maybe a bigger idea for us to think about. And I lost about a year of my life and much of the comfort and security I had not valued until it was gone. Oh, damn. Those are some words right now. Lost much of the comfort and security that we had not valued until it was gone. I'm sure that we are all feeling this right now, that we have lost our comfort, we have lost our security, we've lost the ability to like go to CVS without it being a freaking surgical like situation where you have to put on a mask and gloves and wait out lines 6 feet apart to be let into the store, and you're wondering how many times you're touching your phone or your credit card, and then you have to bring them all home and you have to wash them down again. I mean, what is happening? How easy was life before this? And we didn't even know. So maybe this is something that she's trying to communicate to the reader in the text, and something for you to hold back here in this beautiful part of your brain as you're reading. Like, what is Dana, one of the main characters, our heroine, what is the purpose of her time traveling? What is it trying to teach her? What does she need to learn from this? All right, so the characters that we're introduced to in the prologue are Dana, her boo, her boyfriend, partner, Kevin, and that there's some sort of situation with this losing of the arm that involved the police. She's in a hospital. They mention a mental hospital, being like, oh my God, this is so crazy. Like, if we told people what was actually happening, we would be like locked up in the mental hospital. And the truth of the story is, at the end of the prologue, we find out that Dana and Kevin don't know where the arm is. Where'd the arm go? The prologue is giving us this mystery to establish a sense that this book that you're about to read is not one that's going to make a lot of sense. It's going to have clear answers. That there's going to be a little element of mystery to what's happening next. Okay. All right, chapter 1, the river, just quick summary through here, just so we're all on the same page. All right, it starts on June 9th, 1976. This happens to be her birthday. She's a Cancer, like me. I'm July 8th. Oh, actually, sorry, June 9th is not a Cancer, it's a Gemini. Back off. Sorry, Geminis are not my faves. June 9th, 1976. It's her 26th birthday. I've been trying to, again, since this is the 5th time I'm reading the book, I'm like, oh, is there any significance to like turning 26? Is there like some number significance? But I haven't been able to figure anything out. Her, Dana, and her partner Kevin had just moved from an apartment in the city to a little house outside of the city in Altadena. So they're moving in. They're in the process of unpacking. It's not mentioned whether it's like this dream to like move from the city to like a neighborhood but we can maybe make that assumption that, it is part of this American dream narrative that you get your house with the white picket fence and all that good stuff. So they're unpacking, and all of a sudden she gets like kind of dizzy. She starts to feel a little nauseous, and she says out loud, "Something is wrong with me." And then like, boom, scene change, setting change. She goes from being inside her house in the living room to being outside, totally rural space. She's on the ground. There's grass, there's trees, and there's a river, and there's a child drowning in the river. So this child is Rufus. He's probably he's the antagonist of the story, the bad guy. But right now he's just a child in this chapter. So he's redhead, he's a ginger, a feisty little ginger. He's 4 to 5 years old, and he's in the river drowning when she arrives. She sees him and hears him in the river. His mom's on the bank of the river screaming. So she goes into the river with all of her clothes on, saves him, pulls him out of the river. He's unconscious. She does CPR, saves his life. The woman runs up to her, starts beating on her back. Like, "You killed my kid. You killed my kid." And then the dad shows up. Rufus comes back to life. He's like, he comes back to life. The dad shows up. Big shotgun. That's not a shotgun. That's like a double handgun. I don't know how to make a shotgun with my fingers. Big shotgun in her head. And then she goes back to her house. So a couple things to note here. She moved through space and time. Well, we actually don't know that she moved through time yet. She moved through space. So she moved from her house in California to a rural outdoor setting. We don't know where, we don't know when yet, but we know she traveled through space with her body. And another thing that we know is this time difference, and this was one of your questions here. She asks Kevin when she gets back, like, "How long was I gone?" And he says, "You were there on this side of the living room, and then you reappeared here." Like, boom, like 1 second. You were there, and then you were here. But to her, she was gone long enough to stand up, get her bearings, see the kid drowning, save the drowning kid, drag him to shore, perform CPR, and then she came back, which, had to at least take like 5 to 10 minutes. So one thing that we learn is that when she's time traveling, time is not the same across these dimensions. That like 1 minute here is not 1 minute there. Like 1 minute here in your real life is actually like, 15 minutes there. So that's something to pay attention to, because we'll have like huge ramifications later in the novel. But now at the end of the river, Dana's paranoid because she's afraid it's going to happen again. And Kevin's like, "Oh, let's go out to dinner." Da, da, da. And she's like, "Oh, no. She's even worried taking a shower because she's worried that she'll time travel naked and that she'll like pass out in the shower and wake up somewhere else with no clothes on. And, what would that be? So she's really nervous at the end of chapter 1. All right. We all on the same page? Brief summary. I'm not going to give you chapter summaries every time because, there's crap online and you can read it. But just for these two, I wanted us to like start off on the same page. So she recognizes in chapter 1 that the individuals she came into contact with on the riverbank were dressed odd. They were wearing odd clothing. So the woman was wearing a long, dark dress that covered her from neck to feet. This is the top of page 16, which was a silly thing to be wearing on a muddy riverbank. And the woman had spoken with an accent, a Southern accent. And there was the long, unforgettable gun. Because, if you're walking around LA, even in the 70s, people aren't walking around with a long shotgun. It was kind of a thing of the past. So there's a couple of identifiers in this early chapter that are tipping her off that she is not traveling to an equal year. She's not going from 1976 to 1976, but she's not certain what really is happening yet. Okay, let's keep going. All right, sorry for the blurry picture here. So, slave narrative convention. So, I'm going to toss Kindred over here for a second. So, I was trying to look through my house and find which slave narratives I have. I actually took a class on narrative and captivity when I was at Brooklyn College in the lit department. And it was actually, it was a really interesting class because they not only was it about slave narratives, but you read captivity narratives of Native Americans who were captured by the colonial endeavor in the United States when the white people first got here, and how they were put in these schools to try to train them to be white. And those were really interesting. So here, this is, you see, classic slave narratives. In here we have the life of Oluda Equiano, history of Mary Prince, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, incidents, and the life of a slave girl. So kind of the four heavy hitters here, all in one nice little compact book. So here are some, and then also I have this 12 Years a Slave, which was made into that really intense yet very good movie by Solomon Northrop. So, and he was actually a free man who was captured and sold down south, even though he was free. So it's very complicated. Like there was really no space that, people of African descent were safe in the United States, even if you were born free or you had gained your freedom, because of the Fugitive Slave Act, which is another whole conversation for another time. All right, so classic slave narratives. What are the conventions in this genre? Like, what does everyone have? One, can you see this? The engraved portrait signed by the narrator. So, this was before photography, so they did not take a photograph. There was an engraved portrait of what this person looks like. You can see that he is dressed in, the clothing of a free man. He is not dressed in, the imagery of a slave, such as like the white shirt that's all like ripped and torn up or doesn't fit quite right, and the no shoes, and the his hair is very well coiffed, and he's holding. Do you see what he's holding? He's holding a book there. It's Acts, the book of the Bible, Acts chapter 4, 5. Oh, I wonder what that is. I'm going to look it up. I'll report back. So it starts with an engraved portrait signed by the narrator. All right, so here, and then a page with a claim written by himself. So you see that? Written by himself. Boom. Or something like that. So it has to put it out there that this is an autobiography. It's a slave narrative. It's the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, American slave. He wrote it himself because this was kind of rare, right? Reading and writing, literacy was something that was kept from slaves because knowing how to read and write, you could forge papers for yourself. You could read street signs to escape. You could, do a lot of things. Literacy has always had an element of power to it. And so to be able to write this by yourself as a, escaped slave demonstrates a certain level of intelligence and resilience that they learned how to read and write. So it says there's a handful of testimonials written by your white abolitionist friends or religious figures, or the editors of the book. So let's see. Who wrote this one? William Lloyd Garrison wrote it. Oops, here we go. William Lloyd Garrison wrote this in support of this book from Boston on May 1st, 1845. I know this is flipped and showing up backwards for you guys, so I hope you're a little dyslexic and you can read it. So he is pretty much here being like, it's my man Frederick Douglass. He's legit. Read his story. It's important, blah, blah, blah. And he says the very last lines that say, no compromise with slavery. Sorry. There's so many ambulances to go up and down my street. I'm sure you guys can sympathize. His last lines are, sorry, it's backwards. No compromise with slavery. No union with slaveholders. So he was an abolitionist who was trying to get rid of slavery. All right. Then there's, here's another one. Oh my goodness. This is another letter from Wendell Phillips. Godspeed the day when slavery is over. So again, another supporter. Now, Frederick Douglass does not have a poetic epigraph. An epigraph is kind of a quote or a line of poetry that starts off a book to kind of set the, set the tone. There is one in front of 12 Years a Slave. Here's a poem right here that starts off. I know you cannot read that. I'm just showing you as an example. I'm not going to read that because it is very tiny print. My gosh. Let's see if Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Oh, she has two epigraphs here. See these two quotes? This is Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. One quote from a woman in North Carolina. Northerners know nothing at all about slavery. They think it is perpetual bondage only. They have no conception of the depth of degradation involved in that word, slavery. If they had, they would never cease their efforts until so horrible a system was overthrown. And then this is actually a quote from the Bible, Isaiah 32, chapter 32, verse 9. Rise up, ye women that are at ease. Hear my voice, ye careless daughters. Give ear unto my speech. So that's her calling in the audience there, right? All right. And then we have the actual narrative, which I will go over on the next slide. And then often after, there's an appendix of documentary materials or some sort of, so here, an incident of the life of a slave girl. There's an appendix in the back, which the following is a statement from Amy Post, a member of the Society of Friends, which is Quakers, not just Friends, in the state of New York, well known and highly respected by friends of the poor and the oppressed. As has always been stated in the preceding pages, the author of this volume spent some time under her hospitable roof. So this is an appendix, which often will have documentary materials. Let's see. Appendix for Frederick Douglass. He has one too. Where, what is this? I can't quite tell. It looks like it's kind of a critique of Christianity and its role in slavery. Oh, it's a little juicy. I might have to read that later. All right, so let's go on to what the actual narrative. So this is the conventions of the narrative, like the parts. So now let's talk about the actual, what the story is, because they all follow kind of a pattern. All right, so it's like their life story. Okay, so it starts with the I was born, like birth date, where you were born, some sort of sketchy account of parentage, often with a white father who was the slave owner and who fathered this individual through rape. Then it goes on to the description of a cruel master, mistress, or overseer, or all of the above. The story of receiving your first whipping, and subsequent whippings, and also many stories of enslaved women as recipients of violence and sexual violence. Of course, all of these narratives were written in this very formalized, it's not at all Old English because that's from like the Middle Ages, but a very formalized like language, which is why I think students hate reading slave narratives so much, because They do not write in a way that is easy for us to read. It's a very formal English. So even if they're saying all of these things, it's not at all with language that's crass or disrespectful, or it's very polite still. Often there's an account of that one strong, pure African slave who like fights back, refuses to be whipped. You can imagine what then happens to them. Barriers raised against slave literacy and how hard it was to learn to read or write, because not only is it incredible that these individuals escaped slavery, it's incredible that they, had the ability to read and write as well. Maybe there's a connection, I'm not sure. Often there's a description of the Christian slaveholder, and it's often this Christian slaveholder who is the worst in terms of whipping, rapes, treatment of the slaves, but they do it under this, holier than thou guise of Christianity. Description given of the amounts and kinds of food, clothing given to the slaves. The narrative, we're continuing here, there's a few more. Then there's often the account of the slave auction. I'm getting edged out here. Families being separated, husbands being sold away from wives, parents being sold away from children, children being taken from their mothers, and this usually some sort of imagery of all the slaves chained together and then walking deeper south. The deeper south you get, the worse slavery gets, which is to keep in mind when you figure it out actually where Dana is going in Kindred, and why Octavia Butler chose this place as opposed to other spaces in which slavery was enacted at this time. Description of patrols, of failed attempts to escape, pursuit of men with dogs, and then description of the successful escape. Laying low in the day, traveling by night. The North Star is a common theme, both actual following the North Star and metaphorically and symbolically what the North Star meant. And then the reception in the Free States by Quakers. And Quakers are not like, this guy here. Not this guy. Not this Quaker. Although that's what they looked like. A Quaker meaning that the Quakers were a religion in the Northeast, largely in Pennsylvania. And Harriet, you'll see you watch that movie, she goes to Quakers. And they were big supporters of the abolitionist movement of that slavery was a sin and that any good Christian should not be partaking in it, or any human being, period, should not be partaking in it. Towards the end of the narrative, there's this taking of a new last name because, slaves were given their masters' last names. So they would, break up with that last name. And so they could have a new identity as a free man or woman, but they would keep your first name for continuity of identity sometimes. And then it usually concludes with some reflections on slavery, like what it meant to them, what they learned, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Got that? Okay. I don't know if you guys read anything in high school. I know that we used to teach the narrative of Frederick Douglass, and I also know the students all hated it, which was always unfortunate. They always said they had slavery fatigue, that they just got tired about talking about slavery through in American global history and American history, and then literature classes. They're like, miss, that's enough. So the neo-slave narrative is kind of like taking this narrative and shaking it up and repackaging it. It is another genre of writing. So it's a contemporary narrative of slavery. It started after World War II. After World War II is also when a lot of colonized countries in Africa, India as well, got freedom from their colonizers. And so, there was a big shakeup in the world from World War II, and then the reverberations from that shakeup continued to ripple for decades afterwards. And again, so here it gained popularity in the 60s with the civil rights movement in a lot of countries in West Africa gaining independence. And in the 70s here in the US with the Black Power movement. And then it kind of had a resurgence in the late 20th, early 21st centuries. I'll show you some books in a second. So what this genre tries to do is to challenge the history and the historiography of slavery. And historiography just means like the study of historical writing or how the writing of history. Because the way history is written, if you think about your American history textbooks that you used in high school, it never tells you about slavery or the civil rights movement from the perspective of the people, the oppressed. It always kind of gives you this bird's eye view. I mean, there are still some history textbooks that say like, oh, slavery wasn't that bad. I mean, I know that's another whole conversation, but so it's trying to change the perspective and like whose voices actually get heard and whose vision or experience is actually the prominent one in these stories. So the goal of the neo-slave narrative is to rework these accounts so that it's not, a story told by someone from the dominant part of society, nor is it actually this like super linear, like bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum, like kind of formulaic story that's like shifted around a little bit. I also wanted to really explore and expose brutality of slavery's history. Like I said, in these stories, they'll write about the truth and what happened, but it's still written in this very polite, formal language. These news stories are like, no, we're not going to be polite about this bullshit any longer. We are done. We're going to tell how horrible it was because people are not getting it, right? So slavery history, cultural memory, like what is it? How is it a culture impacted by the generations and generations of enslavement, representation of different types of people, enslaved, running, free, resistance. How we very rarely hear about the many, many ways people fought back, right? Identity. Remember, we're all intersectional beings, so you are your race, but you're also your gender, you're also your class, you're also your sexual orientation. A lot of times in like a slave narrative, this isn't really touched. It is touched upon because female slaves and male slaves were treated very differently, but to criticize that and explore it a bit more. And subjectivity, meaning how one person is experiencing it individually. So a big focus of the neo-slave narrative is a formation of post-slavery subjects. So what does that mean? Which it centers the subjectivity, like the story, on the enslaved Africans' experience. And they don't call anyone a slave anymore because they felt the word slave kind of took away the humanity of someone because you're not a person anymore, you're a slave. So they would say like, this person is an enslaved African, not their slave. Small little language things like that seem kind of like nitpicky, but they actually over time become really powerful. So some big like neo-slave narratives that, everybody knows about. Beloved by Toni Morrison. This one has ghosts haunting, a freed woman in Ohio with she thinks she ran away. I don't think she's actually given freedom. We have infanticide. If you don't know what it means killing of your kids. She has a freed boyfriend but has the whole back scarring from the whip. This book will stay with you forever. If you have not read it, I suggest that you do, just so you can be an educated person, because it is probably one of the most important books in American literature that you will read in your entire life. So this is a neo-slave narrative as well, kind of shifting from a slave narrative to one that has like a little bit of magic in it with the ghosts and the hauntings, but also how a woman's identity tied up with motherhood, tied up with terror and racial terror and fear. I mean, it's really, really powerful, which is why it's so well known. Some ones from the 21st century that just came out. These are really new ones. I have them in hardback, but now they're in paperback, so you could definitely get them. So this is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. He lives in New York City. Look for him on the train. This is what he looks like. Look at that sexy beast. So this is like a little bit of magical realism in it. It kind of portrays the Underground Railroad as like a subway. It's like underground, and it's like this railroad, which of course was not true. We all know, I hope we all know, that the Underground Railroad was just a series of people who hid slaves on their journey from the south to the north to freedom. There was not a literal railroad, and it was not underground. I know we're all New Yorkers, and I miss the subway. I ride the subway. But he kind of takes, since this is fiction, kind of takes like the history of slavery and then weaves it into some like magical realism. But then you can tell in reading it that there are parts of it that are taken from historical research. Like there's this one part in North Carolina, which is where I'm from. So my heart was like exploding reading this, where there's this small town that has this kind of lynching tree, and every week they gather and they lynch people that have been caught, and the whole town comes and has like a picnic, and it's disturbing and really effed up. And he does not shy away from the horror of what it was to be one, either escaped or running or hiding or enslaved, or so really kind of exploring this like idea of resistance, like we talked about here, but the terror of living in this state of resistance. It's really, really, really good. I love this one. This is one of my favorite books in my whole life. This is called Homegoing by Gaisi? Sorry, I should have looked up how to pronounce it. I apologize. It's so good. So it starts with two girls in West Africa in, I believe it's like the 1600s. Two girls who were connected. They didn't know each other actually because they were sisters, half sisters. One stays in Ghana and, continues for generations and generations in West Africa. One is sold in slavery and brought to the United States. So every other chapter is the one person from the next generation of these two original half sisters. And it goes from like probably the 15 or 1600s up until like the 21st century. And it's kind of like this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's brilliant. It's the most like brilliant structure that I found it really enjoyable, but also watching not just how, slavery is a part of this book, but it also, even once it ends, how it has an imprint on the other generations. Oh, so good. So good. Maybe next time I teach 215 in English 215, which is the topics class, I'll do like a whole neo-slave narrative book. But you guys will be gone by then. Okay. So moving on. If you want me to write down any of these books, or you're like, what were you talking about? I couldn't see because it was flipped in the camera. Just ask me, because I'm happy to always give you books. Now, representation of slavery has always been a complicated task because there's just always a critic, right? There's always a critic. There's always a hater. There's always a historian who says this isn't right, or there's always the question of who can write these books. Like this book was written by a West African woman from Ghana. This guy, I don't know his actual ethnic makeup, but he is a person of color. Toni Morrison, African-American woman. You know, there was a huge controversy right before COVID-19 exploded about a white woman who wrote a book called Mexican Dirt. And it's about Mexican immigrants coming to the United States, and the world was pissed. Like, who are you to think that you could represent this experience? And, you are so far from it, et cetera, et cetera. So the question of representation is always very complicated. And even when I was looking up images for this slideshow, I came across these two different book covers for the exact same book. Like, look at this one. I mean, if we were in class, I'd be like, what do you see? What do you think? What's it telling you? Blah, blah, blah. But, when I saw this, it's a woman, she's nursing her baby, other kid next to her. I'm not sure what's going on with the top hat situation here, because he seems very dressed up, although they are all dressed very nicely. But, I'd read the title, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I would assume that perhaps this is supposed to be Harriet Jacobs, and she has all these kids, and maybe this is her mom or her sister or just another woman. Maybe this is her kid. I'm not quite sure. Versus this one, exact same book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I mean, this looks like some Italian, romance novel right here. The off the shoulder look with the clavicle, her collarbone showing, and the way she's dressed, she looks like she's coming out of a vineyard collecting grapes in Italy somewhere. And then she doesn't even look like a person of color, which, of course, we all know that from this era, there was a lot of mixing of races. So somebody could have a black mother and white father and look like this, but it just seemed like a really strange, even the clothing seemed European-ish in nature, which of course they were European colonists, so maybe I'm totally off here. But when I saw these two images side by side, when I was just Googling, let's see if I still have the tab open. Yeah, they were just side by side in my Google search for imagery, and I was just like, whoa, what was that? Look at all these different, ways of representation. It's very, very, very complicated. So just something to think about as we continue with this class. All right, hold on. Let me get back to my PowerPoint because I think I am almost done. All right, one more. Yep, that was it. So what I want you to think about while you are reading your next chapters is, how is Kindred mirroring the slave narrative and how is it breaking from the slave narrative? So keep that in mind. Is Dana following a typical slave narrative as the protagonist, the hero of our story? Or is she not following it, but is she reporting on seeing other characters living this narrative life, but her life is kind of different? So please read the next two chapters over spring break. Again, spring break starts the 8th and it goes into the 19th. Do reading and discussion post 4. One of your extra credit options is available now. So if you watch any slavery movie over spring break and write just a brief summary and email it to me, I'll give you extra credit. It'll be worth a reading and discussion post. Keep in mind while you're watching it, the setting, what slavery is actually like, just so you can have a better understanding of what era and what situation Dana is time traveling to. Keep in mind, though, if you watch a slavery movie and it takes place in the Deep South, like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, that's a very different slavery culture down there than, say, Maryland, which is where you will find out in The Fire, where Dana is traveling to. So write a brief summary and email it of the movie and email it to me if you want extra credit. All of the discussion posts are open, so you can still submit any of that work. And please, I know it's just look how beautiful it is outside right now. Look at that sun. It's so pretty. Sorry, all you can see is my bike. I know it's going to start getting really nice out, but we need to please stay inside. If you go outside, wear a mask. Wash your hands. Don't touch anything. This is not a spring break that any of us dreamed of having. I should have been in Spain right now, just drinking wine and hanging out with my girlfriend. And I am trapped in my apartment with my cats, who I now realize I am allergic to. So please just hang on. Stay inside so you don't get sick. Stay strong. Hopefully, as saying in one of my earlier PowerPoints, maybe it was last week, but my only goal for April is to not get sick and not go into a hospital in New York City in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, because this is when it's the worst. So my goal is to hunker down as much as it sucks, stay inside as much as possible, and stay away from being hospitalized at this point in our city's fight against this disease. All right, please email me anytime, and I miss you, and I hope you and your families and your friends are all well. And you can be in touch over the break. I'm not going anywhere. All right, love you. Bye.